wanted to talk a little bit about some of the history of Britain controlling the Holy Land at the beginning of the last century, and how it affected things and setting things up for King Charles III to have a position through ruling through the countries of the Commonwealth, and Israel and Palestine recently in talks about maybe becoming members of the Commonwealth, which would put them under the King Charles III. But it's interesting to go back in the history and just see how Britain played a role back then, so how easily they could play a role in the future. And this is really interesting history, how Britain stirred the cauldron of conflict in Palestine. Having ousted the Ottomans from Palestine in 1917, Britain administered a territory that was already a tinderbox of tensions between Arabs and Jews. Matthew Hughes explores the bloody end of the Palestine Mandate and the emergence of the State of Israel. Written by Jonathan Wilkes, published Tuesday, June 6, 2023. Early in the morning of July 31st, 1947, two unusual shapes were spotted swinging from eucalyptus trees near Netanya. Recognizing them as human bodies, the authorities in this coastal town in northern Palestine soon found notes pinned to the bodies identifying them as Clifford Martin and Mervyn Pace. These British Army Intelligence Corps sergeants had been kidnapped by insurgents of Irgun Zvi Leumi, the National Military Organization, a nationalist Jewish paramilitary unit. The Irgun had held them in a sealed, soundproof bunker, hoping to use them as bargaining chips to save the lives of 3 Jews sentenced to hang by the British for their part in mass prison break, a crime punishable by death penalty. For 17 days, Martin and Pace were held in a tiny airless cell. Then, after the 3 Jews were executed, the British men were also hanged. Executed, the note stated, for criminal anti-Hebrew activities. When a British captain cut down Martin's body, it fell onto an explosive booby trap, blowing apart the body, damaging Pace's, and injuring the officer. The incident enraged the media in Britain, where the Daily Express ran photographs of the hanged men alongside the headline, "Hanged Britons, picture that will shock the world." There were anti-Semitic riots across the UK, and British soldiers attacked Jews in Tel Aviv. This was just one of many violent incidents during British rule of Palestine, which ended in 1948. Gaining a broader picture of that turbulent period, especially the context and legacy of the British Palestine Mandate, is crucial to interpreting the forces that shape the modern State of Israel, which marked the 75th anniversary of its foundation in the spring of 2023, and to understanding the roots of the Palestine situation today. When did the British take control of Palestine? Why were Jewish Irgun fighters in Palestine killing British soldiers who a few years earlier had fought the Nazis? To answer this question, we need to rewind to 1917, when British-led troops advanced from Egypt, defeated Ottoman forces who were fighting on the side of Central Powers in occupied Palestine, part of the Ottoman Empire's territory in the Middle East. On December 11th, 1917, British General Edmund Allenby walked through the Jaffa Gate into Jerusalem's Old City, symbolically establishing British control of Palestine. Ironically, British had never wanted Palestine, preferring weak Ottoman rule. Colonial administration was burdensome and expensive. And by the way, the whole story about Edmund Allenby capturing from the Ottoman Turks after 400 years the Holy Land. It's truly a miracle, that story of him reading the Bible in his tent. And he was reading an excerpt of a battle that took place where the men crawled up the side of a hill. I think it was called Mishmash or something. And you really should see this battle. It's amazing. But just like how the Lord confused the people within their own camp so they were killing each other instead of fighting the people that were coming after them, the same thing happened in this battle. And the Ottomans were completely confused and started killing each other. And so it allowed for General Allenby of Britain to take the Holy Land. So what was the Balfour Declaration? The turmoil of the Mandate and the modern era had its roots in the Balfour Declaration, issued on November 2nd, 1917. In its 67 words, British Foreign Secretary A.J. Balfour announced vaguely that Britain would view with favor a Jewish national home in Palestine without prejudice to existing Palestinian inhabitants. And without prejudice in a court of law, I happen to know that that means that once the issue is settled, it cannot be tried again without prejudice. If it's with prejudice, it can be tried again, but without prejudice, what's done is done. So Jews had been buying land and settling in the region since the 19th century, particularly since the publication in 1898 by Austro-Hungarian Jew Theodor Herzl of Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, a pivotal text in the political development of Zionism, the nationalist movement striving for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. British rule, though, boosted numbers of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. In 1922, the League of Nations passed the Palestine Mandate, colonial rule under nominal League auspices, to Britain, which agreed formally to facilitate Jewish immigration. The world's greatest imperial power now supported Jewish migration to Palestine, which at that point meant British-governed territory west of the River Jordan. The territory to the east was now Transjordan, now called Jordan. How quickly did the Jewish population in Palestine grow? Arab Palestinians, with their growing national identity, resisted Jewish immigration and settlement. The expanding Jewish community, or Yishuv settlement, fought back, while the British tried to keep the peace. Jewish land purchases from absentee Arab landowners disposed Palestinian peasant farmers, so loss of land was central to the fight, as was the changing demography. Palestine's Jewish population roughly quadrupled from about 8% of Palestine's population in 1918 to a third by the late 1930s. After riots between Jews and Arabs flared in 1929, London permanently garrisoned 2 infantry battalions in Palestine. Additionally, surging troops into the territory during heavy unrest, Jewish immigration shot up after Hitler's rise to power in 1933, with more than 60,000 arrivals in 1936 alone, prompting a full-scale Arab revolt that was brutally repressed by British security forces. British police had tracked down and killed the committed Palestinian resistance under leader Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam in a gun battle in 1935. In a lull in the Arab revolt in 1937, the British Peel Commission proposed partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab areas. That mission failed, with Palestinians rejecting the loss of land that would ensue. In the 1930s, British soldiers trained Jewish forces to fight Palestinian insurgents, and the paradigm of the tough Jewish warrior was forged. Future Israeli leaders such as Moshe Dayan and Menachem Begin served in Jewish paramilitary units such as Haganah, the Defense, and Irgun. How the Second World War changed the situation in Palestine. The looming war in Europe turned the situation on its head. Britain, keen to appease the Arab and Muslim world and ensure its backing in the new conflict, executed a political U-turn. In May 1939, the British government issued a white paper that effectively ended Jewish immigration to Palestine. So, in 1939, the British government effectively ended Jewish immigration there. This scuppered the Balfour Declaration, prompting Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion to write of the 1939 White Paper, quote, "A more evil, foolish, and short-sighted policy could not be imagined. Satan himself could not have created a more distressing and horrible nightmare. Britain was no longer a friendly power." So keep that in mind when we're thinking that, King Charles III, and because they were under British rule and part of the British Empire, they can easily sign up to become part of the Commonwealth. And even today, you don't have to have been under British Empire at any time. You can just apply to become a member. And this gives certain benefits and all of this stuff. And with the tech, trade, the other things that they mentioned in that 7-year document to 2030, part of that is the climate change and gender and the health system, vaccines, all that. You name it. They're trying to work with the UK now with this 2030 agreement. That's for 7 years. And anti-Semitism before 1939 had forced European Jews to migrate, with many heading to Palestine. The geographic focus of the Jewish Zionist national movement for a state since the late 19th century. During and after the Second World War, Jews fleeing the Holocaust and the concentration camp survivors left in displaced persons camps across Europe looking for a home in Palestine, and Zionist activists supported the mass movement of these refugees. Britain was now the enemy, stopping Jews reaching Palestine. So they were interfering with them going back. And, he couldn't have said it better himself that, Satan allowed that to happen. Satan was causing them not to be able to go back. By that time, resistance and repression had exhausted the Palestinians. The Yishuv, meanwhile, was well organized politically, powerfully, militarily, and economically, and ready for its chance to seize power from the British and create a Jewish state of Israel, led by men such as Ezra Danan, a fluent Arabic speaker. The Yishuv initiated an excellent intelligence service, Sherut Yediot, or information service, itself superseded in 1948 by new Israeli intelligence services, including Shin Bet and Mossad. So what happened in the Jewish revolt? Jewish dissidents started attacking British targets. In 1944, splinter group terrorists in Lehi, a Hebrew acronym for Freedom Fighters for Israel, killed British Colonel official Lord Moyne in Egypt. Lehi was also known as the Stern Gang, after its leader, Avraham Stern, who had been shot dead by British police in 1942 while trying to escape, prompting accusations that he had been killed in cold blood. His extremist insurgent group fought on. The Jewish revolt had begun. Supporters in the U.S. helped the insurgency, and Jewish resistance fruitfully combined helping Jewish immigrants coming from Europe on refugee boats with purely destructive acts of terror against Britain and Palestinian targets. Yet Jewish terror attacks alone did not defeat Britain. Where Britain's interests made it stand fast, it fought the long war as it did later in Malay and Northern Ireland. How did the British react? But in Palestine, London had no political solution to the irretractable conflict caused by its earlier decision to promote Jewish immigration. Moreover, as the Cold War began in earnest, Britain was rejigging strategic bases in the region while looking to maintain strong points elsewhere in a world of greatly weakened imperial power. At first, the British fought the insurgency and in 1945 enacted draconian emergency legislation. Soldiers executed huge cordon and search military sweep operations of Jewish neighborhoods with code names such as Agatha, Shark, and Elephant. British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, who had landed in Normandy in 1944, were deployed in Palestine to fight another end-of-empire counterinsurgency. Soldiers who arrived with sympathy for the Jews were mystified by Jewish hostility by the chants of Gestapo and English bastards by Jewish children taunting them. Soldiers with metal detectors searched Jewish settlements for weapons caches known as slicks. Slickeriot was a Jewish woman hiding weapons. They screened thousands of Jews caught in cordons, checking names against wanted lists with black and white mugshots. However, British military intelligence lacked reliable Hebrew language officers, and very few British police officers spoke Hebrew, limiting intelligence gathering. Jews targeted and assassinated those who did. Where it had succeeded against the Palestinians in 1936 to 39, Britain now failed with the Jewish insurgency. Insurgent leaders stayed hidden, continuing the violent fight, while Haganah encouraged illegal immigration to increase the Jewish population. What other successes did the Jewish insurgency have? There were major Jewish terror successes. In 1946, Irgun men disguised as Arabs rolled explosive-filled milk churns into the basement of the luxury King David Hotel, which housed British Army headquarters in Jerusalem. The resulting explosion demolished an entire wing, killing 91 soldiers and civilians, including 17 Jews. Such outrages increased pressure on Britain. When the British legally flogged a captured Jewish insurgent, Irgun men seized and whipped a British officer, sending him home in his underwear, and publicly lashed 2 other soldiers in a park. Such abuse elicited harsh British reprisals, but it stopped British floggings of Jews. Jewish operatives also blew up the British Officers Club in Jerusalem. Palestine had become an armed camp, with fields of barbed wire surrounding military bases. Jewish restaurants and bars were off limits to soldiers, and British newspapers ran headlines asserting, "It's time we get out and rule or quit," asking, "Must our boys die?" A civil war inside Palestine before May 1948 becomes an international war with the formation of Israel as the new Jewish state fights armies from Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Syria. By 1949, well-organized Israeli troops had pushed out Arab forces in advance to capture what would become the town of Eilat on the Red Sea. For Israelis, this is an independence war. What were the British soldiers' attitudes to the Arabs and Jews? Arabs and Jews alike complained of British bias, each seeing the occupying administration as acting against their own community while favoring the other. In fact, Constable Sidney Burr's claims that local Arabs and Jews were all ugly specimens seems to have summed up rank-and-file sentiment. The imperialist British liked and disliked Arabs and Jews in equal measure. Some British servicemen, though, deserted the boorish, ill-mannered Jews, preferring the gentlemanly, easygoing Palestinians. They said, "Quite honestly, we found it fun," one soldier recounted of his experience fighting Palestinians, very different to the war against the Jews who played a dirty game, adding that one understood the Arabs in a way he wasn't as merciless as the Jew could be. That British veteran concluded that the Jews ran rings around us and pulled off the most fantastic coups. Angrily, rank and file British soldiers called out pigs or bloody Jew and shouted Heil Hitler at passers going by. So they were saying all kinds of nasty things. Did the British send the special forces? Colonial officials bemoaned hearing not a word of thanks from the Jews for what Britain had done for them in Palestine. In an effort to get a grip on the Jewish insurgency, they called in Second World War special forces veterans such as decorated SAS Major Rory Farran. He and his squad set out to give the insurgents a bloody nose, and they were not the only unit to do so. They operated in civilian clothes but lacked fluent Hebrew speakers, so they were spotted by Jews. Jewish operatives had infiltrated the police, and Farran could not rely on its detectives. So, with tacit official backing, Farran's men launched a covert dirty war. The campaign backfired sensationally. After Farran and his men seized Alexander Rubovich, a Jewish teenager caught putting up Lehi posters, the young man disappeared, never to be seen again. It was suggested that Farran's men had beaten Rubovich to death and disposed of the body, Farran's installed hat having been found at the abduction site. The Jewish community protested to the British authorities, who denied the presence of black ops units and moved to court-martial Farran. Threatened with prosecution, he fled to Syria, ending up in a brothel in Aleppo. Ultimately, Farran escaped prison, but a year later, Lehi terrorists sent a letter bomb to his family home in the UK, killing his brother who opened it by mistake. By late 1947, anxious to escape the Palestinian quagmire, Britain cut its losses and passed on the seemingly irretractable problem to the newly formed United Nations. In the autumn of 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine once more recommended a partition into Jewish and Arab territory, but now with a much bigger Jewish area. Though accepted by Jewish groups, this proposal also failed when Palestinians refused to give up their lands. Events on the ground quickly outpaced the UN's goodwill as Jews and Palestinians and neighboring Arab states went to war. While British troops left in waves, killings proliferated. There were massacres on both sides, including the slaughter of more than 100 Palestinian villagers at Deir Yassin in April 1948 by Irgun Lehi men, and of Jewish medical convoy personnel heading to a Jerusalem hospital by Arab forces. So when was the State of Israel formed? On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the new State of Israel and became its first prime minister. The British were responsible for law and order until that midnight, when they passed power to the Jews, to the Jewish Agency. That body had a precise list of the various colonial government departments to appropriate, from the Auditor General to statistics, surveys, and urban planning. British imperial ruling mentalities, rather than sympathy for Zionism, was behind the transfer of power to Jewish officials as Israel came into being. If the Arabs had had a government in waiting as the Jews did, things might have gone differently. As it was, war immediately broke out between Palestinians and the new state. British troops were still in the process of quitting the territories. With the ignoble departure of the last soldiers from Haifa port on June 30th, a stark contrast with the glory of Allenby's triumphal entry into Jerusalem 3 decades earlier. What happened after the British left? When the first Arab-Israeli War ended in 1949, Israel had won, expanding its territory to include all of British Mandate Palestine except Gaza, occupied by Egypt, and the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem. The West Bank is basically Judea and Samaria, both under Jordanian rule. Israel would conquer these territories in the 1967 Arab-Israeli Six-Day War. The state that became Israel picked up the day-to-day running of the country. Britain's mandate moment in Palestine was short, but it was profound in the way in which it laid the foundations for a Jewish state and a Palestinian refugee crisis. It also marked the start of the end of Britain's global imminence. The Soviet Union and the U.S. became the key international players, and the Cold War replaced the British imperialism that had laid the foundations for the Arab-Israeli conflict that continues in one form or another to this day. So this paragraph is really interesting to me because, it said that Israel picked up the day-to-day running of the country of Britain's mandate, and that their control in Palestine was short, but profound, because Britain had laid the foundations for the Jewish state in a Palestinian refugee crisis. So, doesn't it make sense to you that since they were the ones that started it, that King Charles III would come in as the anointed one that Israel is accepting as kind of like a peace broker? He's got this 7-year agreement of peace and security and the tech and trade and climate and health and all of these green agenda, all of this stuff. It makes sense that since I told you about in this article that I read you, I just couldn't believe it, that Israel had been thinking about becoming and, signing up as a member of the Commonwealth. And that would put them under King Charles III. And the Palestinians have thought about becoming a member of the Commonwealth. Now let's say King Charles III gets them both approved as signing up as members of the Commonwealth, and then they would be under the British King, King Charles III. And this would place him right there as the one who sits on the throne, the anointed one, and Israel sees the anointed one as Messiah. So that caught my eye about them being the ones who laid the foundations for the Jewish state and the Palestinian crisis. So will this king be the one to broker the final peace and security deal between the two and lay it to rest finally? And I think it's interesting that it also said that it marked the start of the end of Britain's global imminence. Well, what if their global imminence is revived when they go under the Commonwealth of Britain? Because they see it with all of this tech, trade, and, all of the inventions and all of that Israel is well known for being at the forefront of all the other countries in this, and Britain wants to be a partner in that. And so we just had the largest House of Lords delegation, until Thursday, being in Israel, meeting with them, discussing all of these issues that are in the 7-year agreement. And I definitely believe that they will allow the king, the anointed one, to perform the red heifer sacrifice, which I think is a blood covenant with many to restart the sacrificial system, which also if this king does this as the anointed one and performs that the Messiah would perform the red heifer sacrifice, and then that would purify all the people. The ashes, I guess they're brushed on the people, and then it purifies them to start the sacrificial system. So it is the Antichrist who stops that sacrificial system halfway through the 7-year time of Jacob's trouble. Interesting that this UK agreement is a 7-year plan, and if he performs that red heifer sacrifice or is invited to do it as some sort of special treat, and then they give King Charles III the crown that they've made for the Messiah and the Torah scroll that they've made, that they said that they would present to the king or to their anointed one when he came to Jerusalem, which means he's coming from outside Jerusalem. And since Britain is the one who laid the foundation for the state of Israel, it's interesting that Israel will choose a Davidic king to sit upon the throne, which actually has already happened if technically you think that Jacob's pillar stone, Jacob's pillow, Israel, King Charles III was coronated upon that stone. And also the anointing oil part of it came from the olives, from the Mount of Olives, including other ingredients that I talked about on other videos. But you can see how the past history culminates with King Charles III, and he's knighted all these rabbis, and his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, knighted other rabbis, one of which was Jonathan Sacks, a great friend of King Charles III. So there's others, and they're working behind the scenes. They've been talking to their Messiah for quite a while now, the last couple of years. So we know that they know who that person is that they plan to have sit on the throne. And you can see how easily all this just falls into place. It doesn't really need to be made to happen. You know, you don't have to take some rogue person and, well, let's make him the Messiah. But it's just by hereditary circumstances and the fact that this king, you know, with the constant clashes between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it makes sense to me that the British king is the one that's going to come in and finally put an end to this conflict that they created at the foundation of Israel. So will it be through them becoming members of the Commonwealth under the king? I believe that's how it will happen. And, you know, there's certain benefits that come with being in the Commonwealth. And there's 56 nations that the king is now king over, ruling. So they would just be 2 more that would apply and become members. Now, technically, Israel can become a member because they were part of the British Empire back then. And anybody that was part of the British Empire can become and apply to be a member state of the Commonwealth. So now that rule has changed, and there's 2 countries that I told you in another video who they were, but they did not have to have the British Empire anymore in their past ruling over them. They could just apply and become a member. And apparently this is what Donald Trump was trying to do with a governor in Mississippi to try to get America to be a member of the Commonwealth. And if that's true, that's very dangerous for our history, having come out from the British Empire and become a free nation of our own back in the American Revolutionary War. So this is all very interesting. I'm just kind of giving you the background and showing you how King Charles III fits right in as being the peace broker between the 2, Israelis and Palestinians. And also the fact that they're trying to get Saudi Arabia signed in with this Abrahamic Accords. Now, a long time ago, I told you that Turk, Adnan Oktar, that had the harem of women, and the Sanhedrin rabbis were meeting with him, including Yehuda Glick, and the man went to jail for his crimes and stuff, but They were all just really looking to him to be something. So I remember Adnan Oktar, the Turk, saying that all these Sanhedrin rabbis needed to do was get these Arab countries together, and then they would look for the Messiah and put him on the throne. Okay, so what have the Abrahamic Accords done but gather the Arab states and countries into the Abrahamic Accords? So now I think one of the last members would be Saudi Arabia. Once they get that done, then they got their Messiah they're going to choose and put on the throne. So technically he's already on the throne, and all of the ceremony of the British monarchy is based on the coronation of King Solomon and King David. The whole ceremony is ancient, and it goes back to the biblical coronation ceremony. So technically, they see him as the rightful heir to the throne of David, because he claims to have a genealogical line back to David, and of course to many other things that we already know. So that's all I wanted to share, was just how all of that past comes together, making the king the peace broker in the end for the last 7 years. I hope you found this interesting. And with that, I'll just say I'll see you in the next video. Have a blessed evening.